Hello and good afternoon. I'm Sam Thompson, Senior Managing Director at Progress Partners, and I am happy to welcome you to this week's panel, The Future of Sports Media. This is the third panel of our second Progress Connect webinar series titled Business Growth Hacking. This week's webinar has an all-star panel of sports industry execs to give you a broad slate of perspectives and projections of how sports media will evolve in the era of digital rights and this ever-expanding market of digital media. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Gretchen Tibbetts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. It's great to be here today. We promised you a conversation around the future of sports media, but I wanted to make sure we all were on the same playing field where we talk about where we're coming from. And yes, the team internally did have fun with some of those puns, so you'll see a few of them throughout. On the next slide, we'll just want to take through a brief history of sports media. Some of us might remember the fabulous days of ABC's Wide World of Sports and those beautiful mustard jackets. But through the late 70s, it really was newspapers with your box scores, the Sporting Nudes, Sports Illustrated, and then the big three networks. Then 1979 hit with the launch of ESPN. Very quickly also had a number of regional sports networks and sports talk radio. So you start having more voices in the marketplace, but it's still pretty clustered. Then came digital, and I'll call it the first era of digital where we had both digital platforms, but also a number of specialized cable carriers. So Longhorn Network, NBC Sports, NFL Network, but also Sports Business Nation, Bleacher Report, Barstool, Yahoo. And now today, viewing habits have changed again, and highlights are preferred viewing format for many. A lot of platforms have emerged that I call sports adjacent. We have leaders of two of us with us today, and they'll talk about how they position themselves. And it's also been an era where the voice of the athlete is much more prominent, and the athletes have the ability to connect directly with the audience. We just want to, on the next slide, give you a glimpse just for one sport, how the landscape has changed in both the amount of money and the coverage. So we're only talking here about football. So in 1964, you could watch a football game on either ABC or CBS, and collectively they paid $6.6 million for the rights. You can see a slow growth relatively through the 80s. And then we picked just a couple key milestones here. 1993, where we first topped the billion mark. And that's when Fox entered the game. And some of us might remember it was football and The Simpsons that got Fox taken seriously as a network. In 2003, NFL entered the game with their own network, and we crossed the 2 billion mark. And just 2 years after that, we went from 2.2 million to 2.8 billion as ESPN spiked their fees to get Monday Night Football. Today, I'm not even going to read all of the platforms and the places that you could watch a game in 2017, and we had crossed the $5 billion mark. I see Raleigh smiling. She was at Twitter at that time, so we might get some stories out of her later. And that just takes you through what the NFL did. The next slide is very dense. There's a lot of numbers on here, and there's a lot of things that start with a B. So the US sports market alone in 2019 was worth $22.4 billion. And what's also happening, if you look in that top right, is that it's not just traditional TV rights, it's also the digital media rights that have grown exponentially and really driving a lot of the money coming into this market segment. And many of us believe it was first digital, then the platforms and streaming that have allowed the continued expansion and growth for sports adjacent highlights. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today as we look to the future. So now I want to introduce the panelists that are here with me in alphabetical order. Raleigh Gray, who's the Senior Director, Athlete Exchange at Wasserman. Ray Roberts, Director, Unified Champion Schools, Urban Development Special Olympics, and also a veteran of 2 NFL teams. Scott Singer, EVP Strategy, Partnerships, and Corporate Development at Whistle, and Brian Verne, founder and CEO of Wave. So I'm going to ask each of them to take a few minutes and share with us their background and thoughts they have for us today. Raleigh, will you kick us off?
I'm happy to. Thank you so much for having me, guys. And despite all of the great information Gretchen shared off the top, if anything, I have learned I need a new headshot because Brian's is ominous and amazing. So I need to get on that. But thanks again for having me. I'm Raleigh Gray. As Gretchen mentioned, I did have a tenure at Twitter, but prior to that, I was with ESPN on the marketing side. I also spent time at Players Tribune. I'm now at Wasserman, where I lead the organic side of a team called Athlete Exchange. You won't have heard of that brand, but effectively our role is to help champion the digital platforms and footprints of our roster of athletes and connect them with not only their fans, but certainly brands as well. I also am the CEO and founder of Must Love Sports, which is a networking group, and have the opportunity to work not only with great folks like this to connect folks in the industry, but also connect students to what their passion is, because mine has always been aligned media, technology, and sports. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Ray?
No, my name is Ray Roberts. I'm a jack of all trades and kind of a master of none. I'm a keynote speaker. I'm a career life coach person. I mentor a lot of different athletes on every different stage, whether it's high school, college, NFL. I've worked as a diversity inclusion specialist at Microsoft in the gaming division. And so I've done a bunch of different things. Currently, my job is the Director of Urban Development for Unified Champion Schools at Special Olympics North America. And so basically we have a school-based program called Unified. And so it's 3 components: unified sports, students with and without intellectual disabilities playing sports together; inclusive youth leadership, which is that same concept, but sharing leadership opportunities in the school; and then whole school engagement, where you bring awareness to the abilities of our students with intellectual disabilities to the entire school. And so my job is to create strategy to get those resources to the students that are in inner city schools and urban development and urban communities around the country. So played football, was an All-American at the University of Virginia, was a 1992 10th pick in the draft for the Seattle Seahawks, played with Seattle for 4 years, played in Detroit for 6 years, retired, got a master's degree from the University of Washington in education. And so I've just been kind of in this space around youth and sports and leadership for the last few years.
And you may have noticed that Raleigh and I both clapped. So you do have 3 University of Virginia Cavaliers on
right, those cross sabers.
Cross sabers. Scott?
Does it count that my colors are orange and blue? I hail from Bucknell, so there you go. I am Scott Singer. I lead strategy, partnerships, and corporate development, among other things, at Team Whistle. And I say Team Whistle because we've been growing and adding new IP and audiences and capabilities to expand beyond our roots in simply sports to sport attainment and lifestyle and humor. We play in the positive. It's always about the wins, not the fails. It's motivational, it's relatable, most importantly, uplifting, and what we've been saying for a long time, inclusive. And I know we're going to touch on some of those things in the future. And what we think we're building is basically a powerful engine of massive activatable audiences, IP, and differentiated capabilities that allow both us to monetize our content as well as help the streaming community and both in terms of creating longer format content, as well as using those audiences to attract and engage new subscribers to their platforms as the cable dial gets quickly disrupted over time.
So my name is Brian Verne. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Wave TV. And we think of ourselves as sports entertainment for this next generation. We have built a portfolio of digitally native media brands across really all sorts of sports, everything from more traditional sports like international football, American football, baseball, basketball, etc., to adaptive athletes, to fitness, to weightlifting, to women's sports, gymnastics, cheer, and then some. And our business is really, really simple. And I say that a lot, and sometimes people laugh, but I really mean that. We think that that fandom is something that's really universal, worldwide, particularly in sports. And we've just gone sport by sport, like I said, spun up a digitally native media brand that typically lives across Instagram or Snap or TikTok or Facebook or YouTube or sometimes all of them. Then we've begun to really master the programming formats for those core and emerging digital platforms. And really then we're simply taking the same stories and narratives or the great IP from leagues and rights holders or even individual athletes. And instead of producing an hour-long television show, we turn that into a 3-minute Snap show or an Instagram TV series or whatnot, adapting to the needs of the audience and the platforms that we live on.
Thank you all. We're going to dive right in. I think it's important today to lead off with this. So as leaders in the sports industry, how are you talking to your internal teams, your boards, your audience about inclusivity, diversity, and what's going on in today's world? And Scott, I know you've done a lot at Team Whistle, so I'd like you to start us off here.
Sure. It's an incredibly important component of Whistle or Team Whistle and our business. As I mentioned before, we're about being positive, relatable, uplifting, and inclusive. And, we have, and again, around the wins, not the fails. And so it's all about, why are people involved in sport? It's for motivation, it's for inspiration, it's for humor, camaraderie, and all of those things. And what's important to this generation is, when I say this generation, Gen Z and millennials, is diversity and inclusion. They've been learning it much more so, and they are among the most diverse. About 22% of Gen Z is from an immigrant family, are children of immigrant families. It's actually the most diverse generation we've had so far in America. And so it's important endemically. And obviously we need to right some wrongs that were clearly America's original sins. But with regard to Whistle, we promote diversity and inclusion and a culture of belonging. We need to do more. We have done that both in terms of hiring and in terms of, but again, probably not enough. About 40% of Whistle is female. Of our employee base, about 27% are people of color. About half of our content are either people of color or female, but that's not enough. And one thing that we really want to do is use the platform that we have through our social audience, which when you add it all up, it's about 630 million aggregate sort of social reach of fans, followers, and likes. And clearly there's some duplicity that in that or duplicativeness where someone likes us on more than one platform. But when you dedupe all of that, it's still well over 400 million. And so as a result, we have the platform and feel the obligation to use that to push that social good. It's something that we haven't really done historically. We're going to do that now. We feel that we can't continue and remain sort of silent about that, despite having positive and inclusive and relatable and uplifting content. It has to be even more overt.
Well, can I jump in right there, Gretchen?
Please, Ray.
Yeah, so just because you mentioned the words diversity and inclusion, that's the business of Special Olympics. Like that is at the core of what we do is trying to create inclusive and belonging and diversified opportunities for people to be involved and engage in sports and what all the other activities that are going on in school and around the community. And so as it relates to the conversations we're actually having to try to pivot a little bit to try to put our inclusion focus, have a racial diversity spin to it without having mission creep from really focusing in on people with intellectual disabilities. And so the one thing I will say is that as people are thinking about in inclusion and diversity in their work and their businesses and their organizations and things, really the person at the low end of the totem pole is an African-American female with intellectual disabilities. They're going to be at the bottom of the bottom. And so as you're thinking about diversity, also think about diversity of abilities. And so because a lot of our Special Olympic athletes are very gifted and away from sports, and whether it's editing film or collecting data, they're just really, engaged and smart people like anyone else. But their disabilities become barriers to opportunities, like possibly at Team Whistle or Wave or whatever it is. It becomes a barrier. And so as you're thinking through the diversity and inclusion lens, don't forget about the most marginalized.
Great, thank you both. I'm going to jump to the next question. How has social media and the emergence of new platforms impacted sports media, and I would argue media and communication overall? Brian, why don't you start us off here?
Yeah, I think, it's the reason a business like ours exists, and certainly I think, folks at Whistle and several others would probably say the same. And as the industry has evolved, through each generation, I think there's always been this kind of series of paradigm shifts in terms of where fans have gone to consume content. And, what you're seeing now is, this, I can't see my phone, I guess, holding it up, but the mobile device is the television today for young people. And so, being able to, whether you're a media company or whether you're a league or a rights holder or even an individual athlete who are all storytellers in their own right, being able to adapt and develop programming for where people are is pretty paramount.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I had taken some notes because I wanted to kind of paint a picture for that question. And, I came into the league and to the NFL in 1992. And the first thing that the Seahawks gave me after I signed was a notebook full of opportunities to be in the community, to go volunteer, sign autographs. You're expected to, sign up for so many of them throughout the year to on your day off on Tuesdays. And so in that sense, the team is like controlling their messaging through you. And what the things that you are interested in become the things the team are interested in, whether you want it to be or not. But there's this expectation that you're going to participate in some of these activities and things. I can remember going to the team and saying like, well, this is something I'm interested in. Like, can you help me, with that? And that wasn't a possibility back then. Like, you just had to grind it on your own and try to figure it out. When you fast forward to now and you see players in every league, men's and women's sports are developing their own branding. So then they're being loyal to their brands, I think, on top of of whatever loyalty they have to what the team is trying to brand as far as their outreach and how they communicate. And so it makes it a little bit harder. I would imagine, like I do sports radio for 710 ESPN Seattle here, and it makes it a little bit more difficult when you're asking questions in the locker room after games and you're trying to get answers. And if it doesn't quite, if this person wants to hold that message for their brand and for their outlet of how they communicate to the fans, then you don't get an answer, right? But then right after you leave, they're tweeting it or texting it, or, you know, they have some other, you know, highlight or something they're adding to it and their brand to it. And so then players are starting to control that brand and what's important to them and how they want to communicate with the fans. And whereas before, that wasn't even an option. The only way you engaged fans was in person at autograph signing sessions or appearances or things like that. But now you can engage the whole entire country and world just on a Facebook post or a Twitter post or whatever the other platforms are.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I mentioned relatability, and, you know, you have to think through the lens that your audience is watching your content. You know, for us and generations older, we were used to a bunch of individuals behind a desk, perhaps in a suit and tie, certainly wearing some sort of dressy outfit, you know, talking about the game, whatever that was. That is not relatable at all for someone that's, you know, 15 to, you know, 30 to 40, et cetera. That's not how they see people. That's not who they look to for advice, either online or off. And so you need to speak to them in, you know, an authentic voice that engages them. And I think that in part was why that audience has looked to digital platforms. And it's the digital platforms who are speaking to them in that authentic voice and in a way that engages them as well in a two-way conversation. Because before it was really just a one-to-many broadcast, and truly broadcast, just out into the environment, and it, you know, may or may not have fallen on deaf ears. Today, we're assessing, I'm sure Brian is doing the same, and Ray and others, Raleigh too, about how is our content performing from an engagement, not just a view perspective, but how many comments, what's the nature of the comments, what's the sharing of that content. And so it's a many-to-many conversation, and only gets better by virtue of all of that. I'm sure all of us on the phone or on Zoom can relate to, we probably get most of our content recommendations from friends, if not the algorithm on, you know, Netflix that's telling us what's been most viewed this week, in a very smart way to do that. But we're getting that content elsewhere, and that's what we pay attention to. And it's the same way how we're looking at information and sports, entertainment, or news or commentary, et cetera.
Yeah, there's two sides to it as I see it, and just as you said, Scott, it's incredibly interesting. You know, there's the league and sort of team side, which while I was at Twitter, I watched it evolve from the NFL saying, okay, if you're putting stuff on Vine or Periscope, which were obviously quite important ways of live broadcasting, what sort of ambiance are you allowed to show that is not the literal game on the field? Because those rights, as Gretchen showed, are incredibly valuable. And I actually worked on the team to lead putting NFL on Twitter. And the whole purpose behind that was because the conversation was already happening there. Why not also bring the content to the people who were talking about it? So that's the league and team side. From the athlete perspective of where I sit now, or arguably where I've sat and sort of the career that's unfolded, is traditional media with ESPN, which no one would have said in 1979 was traditional when they started. Then moving on to Twitter, where it's the first singular approach where somebody can literally say whatever they want in the moment. Then to Players Tribune, where you're trying to curate a story that's different, a little bit more weighty, tells a heavier storyline, if you will. to now working on the way we do at Athlete Exchange, which is you don't know who we are because everything comes from the athlete's channel. It's just done in a way that may attract, to Scott's point, more content and attention. But the way that athletes think about it varies by their league. You know, for example, Ray, when he was playing, we talked about this, he's wearing a helmet. Not as many people know who he is from a marketing perspective, because unlike the NBA, you can see their faces on the floor and the court, and they have the ability from the league to do more on social and to engage in a way that doesn't feel conflicted. NHL athletes, they are folks that play as a team. There's an article, right? Not article, pardon me, but a commercial for Scotiabank if you watch NHL TV on the Canadian broadcast, like somebody does. And it's all about we. Same for the MLB, except it's more, they're getting paid a lot of money, so they don't necessarily lend themselves to doing a lot of digital. So they use it differently by team and league, but of course the ability to cut through all of the other things that exist and tell their story is the most important part of how social is being engaged right now.
Great. Thank you all. I feel like we covered some of this, but there's nuances that I want to make sure we hit. So for decades, it was leagues, it was the team owners, and it was that very small group of media that I showed you on that first slide. 3 networks, couple magazines, and your local papers with box scores. And they controlled the messaging around sports, around teams, around athletes. If you read any of these stories back in the day of the early days of baseball, and the writers and the players were all in the same train cars, and who got covered nicely or not nicely, a lot was driven by how good of a drinking buddy you were. And those are, you know, there's a lot of truth to those stories. And Raleigh and I were both at ESPN, and there's a lot of truth to the stories that you read about that. Today, so many factors have come together and coalesced, and there truly is a multitude of diverse voices, including athletes themselves, that can communicate directly. And we talked about this some in the answer to the last one, but Raleigh, I want you to lead off, because we also had a specific question turned in around this. What have you found the most impactful way for female athletes to invest for them and for them to be able to show under this new reality?
Sure. It's a great question, obviously. And I think it's evidenced by the way that Facebook changed their algorithm some, I want to say 2 years ago, and that they wanted us to all focus on community and that aspect. And that benefits people who may have traditionally smaller audiences, therefore female athletes, because they are able to tell their story to their community, and the algorithm, the whole technology that drives all these platforms, affords them the opportunity and awards that to them. So you're seeing folks like, not to tell about our roster at Wasserman, but folks like Megan Rapinoe or Sue Bird, who, you know, some Seattle natives, shout out to Ray and his crew there. But they took the time during quarantine to put on a program every Saturday night called A Touch More. And they brought in guests and friends, most of whom were also female athletes, like a Diana Taurasi. You've got Olympians who are female athletes that typically, and unfortunately, their relevance is really heightened every 4 years. But because of social media, they have the ability to be really available more than that, and introduce themselves to an audience over time that allows them and affords them great opportunities when the games do come back in Tokyo in 2021, for example. So that's the great piece of how we think about female athletes in social, and that they can curate their audience. Community allows for that, and they can do so in such a way that allows them success with brands and their fans, etc.
I added a perfect, Brian. You jump right in on that. Name, image, and likeness.
I mean, with something that we're certainly thinking about a lot, and I would say, you know, what's happening, it's you know, it's about time, in the sense that, you know, if you are a, say, really talented software engineer and you're 18, 19 years old and you're in college, you know, you're going to go work for Google during the summer, and they're going to pay you a lot of money to do that. Or, you know, you might even get funded by a VC to start a business. Whereas, you know, for many, many decades, you've had I mean, particularly within NCAA football and basketball, which are generating, now billions of dollars of revenue. You've had, athletes who, on one hand, the critics will say, oh, they're getting a free education, this and that. But on the other hand, you have players that are generating billions of dollars of enterprise value for their schools, selling tons of jerseys. Everyone's making money off of their name and likeness, besides them. And so I think, with the legislation that is in play now, and then you combine that with the power of social, mobile, and digital, and the ability for everyone to have a voice and be a storyteller, I think you're going to see some really strong fundamental changes in the space, sooner rather than later. And it's definitely something that, we even want to be at the forefront of.
Yeah, I would have to say it's been a long time coming. Because as, even the comment you made, just saying like, people will say, well, you get a free education. And I always tell them the story, if you were going to buy a house on the lake and every house on the lake was $3 million. And then when you got ready to sign the check, they told you, well, you don't get to use it. You don't get to use the lake. You don't get to put your boat on it. You don't get to swim on it. You don't get to fish on it. You don't get to do anything, but you're being charged the same price as everyone else. Well, in that instance, the value of that house would go down, right? Because you don't have access to everything that it said it had. That's the same scenario when you're an athlete in college, especially when you're playing one of the main sports that's very time consuming. There are certain majors that you just don't get to major in. There's certain things that are going on in the university that you don't have access to. At UVA, it's really hard. It would be almost impossible to play football or basketball and major in architecture, because it's just you just can't do it. Even doing like pre-med kind of stuff, engineering is really hard because those areas are really time consuming, and so is football. And so, and then the way the practice schedules are, you don't have access to certain classes or professors. Some of the better professors teach later in the day instead of early in the morning, but you had to take all your classes early in the morning. So you don't really, the value of the education you get, like, we're not saying it's terrible, but it's not like this thing everyone, your access to the college and its resources is the same as everyone else's. And so there is a little bit of a difference in that. And then as it relates to just the money that's generated, I can remember being in college and the only clothes I had was the clothes that they issued us. Like those were the clothes I had, like sweatpants, shorts, t-shirts. And at the time we didn't even have a Nike contract, so I was wearing Puma tennis shoes. And I wore them for everything, but I couldn't, there was no way for me to generate money to go out and buy clothes. I couldn't work during the season. There's certain jobs only certain jobs you could do during breaks in the summer. Like, it's just like, it was just next to impossible. And so for these athletes to then now have some way to generate some revenue to support them to go along with what's going on, like with the amount of money that they generate, I just don't see any problem with what they're trying to get done.
Scott?
Ray, you bring up some really important issues that, we've all obviously been talking about systemic problems, but here's yet another one that athletes face in particular, and regardless of where they come from. And you're absolutely right. I'm very active in my alma mater, and I think that in particular, I think you're right with regard to majors that have significant requirements outside of the classroom, that clearly require labs and other things. You're right, that would be hard. And I think, we want to be supportive of, certainly Whistle wants to be supportive of this as well. And I think we have a unique position through our No Days Off franchise, which has been very successful identifying young up and coming athletes. They're clearly pre-professional. And they're the future generation of superstars, and love to be able to help them connect with brands which we otherwise have relationships with throughout the rest of our organization. So we find that, we could be in a unique place to help, and certainly like to do that. I want to circle back on the content comments around around female athletes, you know, and it just sort of popped to mind that, you know, as I mentioned, a significant percentage of our content does feature female athletes. I flipped up just out of curiosity, and I'd want to say of the last 4 Olympian tips that we, a show we do for the Olympic Channel, 4 out of the last 5 were all female athletes, from javelin throwers to water polo stars. And you know, I think there is, at least from a young male perspective, which is the larger portion of our audience, there's as much of an interest to see the person next to them who may be a female as it is to see the guy next to them and learn about their skills and capabilities and you know, what their experiences have been, and see that from a unique perspective. So you know, again, we may be erring on the side of that purposely, but I think it's a genuine interest from both Gen Z and millennial audiences.
Great. We have a question from the audience that Ray's going to answer some further details around Tom McMillan's statement that ADs are worried about athletes earning money that would otherwise go to the schools. So Ray, you want to take that for us? Thank you for the question.
I think the only thing that I would say to that is, like, is kind of ties into what I said earlier, though, is a lot of that money is going to the school and going to programs in the school that the athletes don't even have access to. And then also just the, you know, there's data that shows like the success of the team also impacts like the number of students that apply to go to school there. So that there's funds to be made that way, and as well as people that just want to donate because they want to be able to say they were part of the UVA uprising or whatever it is. You know, they just want to donate money. So I think there's a lot of other pathways to generate money, and quite frankly, I don't think that that there's going to be some athletes that are going to do probably some pretty amazing stuff, but then for the most part, it's not like they're going to be taking, you know, I don't think billions and billions of dollars away from what's available out there for the schools to still thrive and use sports as a way to generate dollars and donations.
And the cynics would say that since they were both in the news this week, this has been going on for some of your athletes. And I'm just saying what was in the news this week, which would be Zion at Duke, but also the end of Reggie Bush's 10 years. But there's also an opportunity for the athletes who now recently through social media might have something like Caitlin, somebody help me with her last name, the gymnast, who then could millions and millions of views, and she couldn't cash in on any of that because it was against NCAA policies, and she's a gymnast. This was sort of her one shot. And so I do think there's a lot of nuance here, but a lot of opportunity to, just like we talk about these different formats of media democratizing reach, so does hopefully name, image, likeness.
Yeah.
Caitlin's actually an athlete of ours, Gretchen.
Oh, how's she doing now? You want to share stories?
Nothing to share, but she's awesome in the sense that she has built, based off what you just said, a great platform for people to know who she is from that, and a jumping off point to expand what that looks like. She's a poet, she is an artist, she's creative, and she's no longer doing the day-to-day of gymnastics, but she is still very much an athlete in the way that she is approaching whatever is next for her.
So while I don't want to spend a lot of time on COVID and the suspension of live sports, I will admit I am very excited, and I watched NASCAR last week. I never watched NASCAR. I was just like, it's live, I'm watching it. But talk about, particularly Brian and Scott, for you guys, you've been impacted only in a positive way by the suspension of live sports. Your programming, content mix, highlights, storytelling has done very well. So can you give us some of, some of those numbers, some of those thoughts, and as that drives both your business today and where you're going in the future?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick that off. And speaking of NASCAR, it's about time they're on the right side of history too,
Yes.
getting rid of the Confederate flags. But as far as our programming is concerned, it hasn't really changed a whole lot or at all due to COVID, just because we've always been so call it fandom focused, and particularly have leaned into a lot of non-traditional sports, as well as archival programming or kind of human interest programming, stories about athletes. So we've never been overly dependent on that kind of live tentpole programming schedule of the big four or big five, albeit we've always covered it. But we've seen, probably due to just an increase in overall consumption, we've seen an increase in our viewership and engagement during this time, and I imagine Scott and a handful of our other contemporaries probably have as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I agree. I don't know that we've changed our programming. It's all still, around sport adjacency at Whistle, in particular. But what we've seen is, and to paraphrase Microsoft, 3 years of digital transformation in the last 3 months. Our content, our viewership, video views are up about 57% as of Monday versus the first week of March. That was up yet again 5 or 6% this past week. It continues to increase. We've seen no change as the country starts to open up. So viewership has been incredibly strong. Watch time as well has increased over 25%. So we've got engagement. That's one test of engagement and how much the content is being consumed, and then obviously their commentary and other things. And we grab data off of that. We also do some things where we run, for example, the social handles for other parties as well. So the European Premier League, or English Premier League, Amazon Prime Sports, some with the Olympics, do work with Topgolf and others, and helping them do what we've done for ourselves around reprogramming without live sports activity. But, I think, again, it's about, to the point that, Ray had mentioned it, and Raleigh too, it's about the athlete. It's about the sport. It's about their brand and their lifestyle. It's about their personality. And, I think Instagram and other social media have given the power to those athletes to be able to create brands, certainly socially, and then, whether that, extends onto, television in terms of having their own production company. We've done work with Dwayne Wade and Steph Curry and a number of others, and I'm sure, Brian has as well. That's the opportunity out there to sort of grow the conversation. And I know, sport, the amount of time an athlete, the average athlete actually is likely playing professionally is actually quite short, from what I understand. We all know about the superstars that have lifetimes in the business, but that's not the average. And so helping them build that business and build a sort of personality and a brand beyond that gives them that opportunity to have something to go to, if it's not as a sportscaster immediately after their time on the field or on the ice or wherever it may be.
You know, we at Special Olympics, we have a different engagement with all of that because we are a sports organization. And so we specialize in putting on live sporting events. So the people we serve have come to know exactly in the spring when things are happening in the summer, and so they build their schedules around that. And so now we're having to pivot and figure out how do we then offer that same experience virtually. And so using different platforms and to kind of get the message out, to get our messaging out, to create a sense of belonging and inclusion. And it becomes a little bit more difficult when you have to do that, when you're trying to create that culture virtually, because so you can be checked out or multitasking while you're on the screen and all these different kinds of things. And so it has been cool watching some of our state programs rise to the challenge of creating and using other platforms for our athletes to engage in sports and make it as live as possible. But now we're also moving towards this place where we have some really tremendous that have their own brand. And so, I had kind of mentioned to Scott before we got off the call the other day that we need to talk because
we need to have a follow-up.
our athletes are also looking for a place to express themselves because they're very good at it, and we don't necessarily have the platform for them to do that at Special Olympics. So the idea of like trying to figure out how to put on virtual events where you can still feel like the camaraderie and the belonging and inclusion, and then also trying to find ways to elevate our athletes. That's not just what we've done with ESPN or the big media outlets.
Right. We have a question around fantasy, and we had some conversations internally at Progress Partners if we were going to talk about fantasy and the betting landscape and how fantasy was one of the main drivers that enabled betting to go from Vegas or the bookie down the street to something that was mainstream. And we decided that's a whole nother session, but I know Raleigh wanted to jump in quickly and give a little bit of an answer to that. So
we'll keep it as a whole nother session. I will not get long-winded, but like Ray said a moment ago, as you're thinking about the shared screen experience, nothing drives engagement like something else to do while you're watching sports. And I think it's not necessarily, and Kenji, thanks so much for your question, but it's not necessarily just fantasy. It's marrying fantasy with, as you alluded to, Gretchen, the ability to now place bets. And I don't mean the bets that happen before the game. I mean the bets following as soon as the whistle goes, because 75% of betting happens after the whistle starts, where you're betting on who's going to advance the ball where, etc. So the engagement you can think of on that, and then the pool, the handle, obviously the cash that comes to the partners in that transaction is going to be huge. How the athletes get paid for that portion, entirely up to legislation and the teams and leagues, but it's going to be very fascinating as it relates to which broadcasters start to really play in the space and either own a piece of that pie or not.
So I have one final question, and thank you all those who submitted Q&A. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but one final question for each of you from your own perspective. How do you see the landscape of sports and sports media continuing to change in the question was 5 to 10 years, but I'll give you 3 to 5. And one of the other questions is, do you see former athletes playing in that? And then my personal bonus question is, if there's one legacy brand that you're looking at and you keep seeing them doing things and you're just shaking your head, is there one legacy brand that you'd love to take over and change their course? So that's a bonus, but who wants to kick us off? Where we're going, where's the landscape for the next 3 to 5 to 10 years?
Well, I'll start, and just because of these guys that we have here on the call with us, with Brian and Scott, I think everything is kind of going that direction, right? So multiple platforms, athletes controlling their branding, the engagement virtually or electronically or digitally between the fans and the athlete. I think it's going to become more intense that way. You look at around the attention span of people, which is usually like around 10 minutes. So I think like those shorter clips and shorter stories, shorter behind the curtain look to athletes' lives and things, and they share, I think will drive viewership and fandom, if you want to call it that, more than the actual play on the field itself. Like I think the engagement with the individual that is part of the team is going to really be a driver in the next few years.
Yeah. Go ahead, Pat.
I was just going to say, I think there needs to be, let's take COVID aside and, in-person experiences and things that have to otherwise change from a health perspective. I'm looking out the next, after that and onward. I think there needs to be a reimagination of the in-venue experience. The experience, it's expensive. I think rights will only continue to increase. I think they're going to go substantially digital. And that will probably change the experience of how instead of the individuals wearing suits behind a desk will probably go by the wayside if you've got Amazon or you've got others that are owning the major rights to major components of it, because I think they understand the audiences a bit differently. But I think gameplay has to change, and all of the above, and that'll allow for, I think, the opportunity to integrate betting of some sort, but not, I think the generation that, is growing up and going to be the next ticket holders of season tickets. Millennials and Gen Z are going to have a different view of what that means. And you're right about attention span. It's the hardest to reach generation for a reason. They don't sit still and watch games in front of a big monitor. They watch highlights, or they engage with the athlete. And it's also the first generation that is not tied to geography. I grew up in Philadelphia. My team, Sixers, Flyers, Phillies, Eagles. Okay, great. That's my 10-year-old nephew is all about Bayern Munich, and he lives in Connecticut. That's because he has access to be able to see and know athletes anywhere on the globe. And that's something that has to, I think, penetrate the thinking of how we relate with audiences. Again, it's not going to be geographic centric too. So I think there's massive change on many levels.
And on that topic, before Brian goes, and it could be a whole session, is esports. And that as a whole nother segment. But Brian, let's stay in this section for just 3 more minutes. So Brian?
Yeah, I'll be brief, and a lot of it we've touched on it. Certainly, my response probably comes from personal biases and our point of view, but I think you're going to see a more immersive experience. The Snap had their partner summit today, and some of the things that they're doing, innovating around entertainment and being a platform or a camera company, I think is very much integral to the sports entertainment experience that we're going to have in the future. I think storytelling is going to continue to be democratized. Gretchen, to your point, it used to be the same 10 people telling the same 10 stories every single day, on a television. And now, because of, the rise of social, mobile, digital, there is this opportunity to uncover so many of these untold stories, or cover this, more diverse array of fandoms that, maybe, certainly when I was growing up weren't, even top of mind, in the 90s and into the 2000s. And then finally, I think you're going to see the ways that folks like us can make money continue to mature. I think the reality is we're still so early on in this whole kind of life cycle of, call it new media, for a lack of better words. And I think oftentimes that gets lost in translation. You're only a decade in at most. So I think the way that platforms work with media companies or publishers is going to continue to evolve and start to look a bit more like traditional carriage fee and television model over time.
Great.
I'm nodding my head because I was going to take what I thought was going to be the less exciting or contradictory approach, but Brian said it there at the end. I think we've come to a place where we expanded the ways we could come to find great storytelling, and it'll start to contract. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I was a kid, I went to Sports Illustrated, I opened the back, and I knew that Rick Riley was going to be there. And that's where I started in the magazine. So you're seeing things like a cell phone that now only makes phone calls, or coming back to this place where everything is in one place where you can find it, but storytelling will evolve in a better way because more people will have the opportunity to tell it. If we've learned anything over COVID, it's that you can still produce a great program and not make it really expensive. And that's the way that I think things will unfold. I certainly don't want to have the last word on that, but that's what I would say.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for being here. Incredible panel. I appreciate all of you and all of your time. I love that we closed on something that's near and dear to my heart, which is content and quality content, and people will stay with you and spend time if you are giving them what they want, where and when they want it. So I think that's a great thing to end on. I want to, for those of you who are interested in listening and educating and potentially helping to activate with what's going on in the world today, I encourage you to Google Ray and the words he shared on ESPN Seattle. I found them valuable and important. So on behalf of everybody at Progress Partners, all the panelists, thank you all for being here. And we'll see you next week for Tales from the Buy Side.